The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of Rosewood Manor's grand ballroom as I watched her walk through the entrance. After 3 years of marriage, I thought I knew what shock felt like. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for seeing Vanessa Crawford stride into our 5th wedding anniversary celebration wearing the exact same emerald green dress I had specifically chosen for tonight, her platinum blonde hair styled in identical waves to mine, and that predatory smile that had haunted my nightmares since the day I discovered her affair with my husband. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me that David and I were celebrating 5 years of marriage at the same venue where we'd first met, where he'd supposedly chosen me over her 7 years ago. The same ballroom where Vanessa had once cornered me in the ladies' room to tell me I'd never be enough for a man like David Crawford. The same woman who had made my life a living hell for 2 years before finally disappearing from Chicago, supposedly for good. But here she was, uninvited and unwelcome, making her grand entrance exactly 23 minutes into our anniversary dinner, as if she'd been waiting in the parking lot for the perfect moment to destroy everything. Again. My name is Sarah Michelle Turner-Crawford, though most people in Chicago's social circles know me simply as Sarah Crawford, wife of prominent real estate developer David Crawford. What they don't know is that I'm also the woman who spent the last 18 months systematically documenting every lie, every secret meeting, and every financial discrepancy that would eventually bring down the most powerful real estate empire in the Midwest. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the moment that shattered champagne glass marked the end of my naive belief that some people actually change, and the beginning of the most elaborate game of chess I'd ever played. A game where I'd been unknowingly moving pieces into position for over a year, preparing for a confrontation I somehow always knew was coming. The evening had started perfectly. David looked devastatingly handsome in his custom-tailored black tuxedo, his dark hair slightly tousled in that effortless way that had first attracted me at a charity gala 7 years ago. He'd been charming our guests with stories about our courtship, playing the role of devoted husband with an Oscar-worthy performance that would have fooled anyone who didn't know what I knew. Our anniversary celebration was supposed to be intimate. Just 40 of our closest friends and family members gathered in the private dining room of Rosewood Manor, Chicago's most exclusive venue. David had insisted on the location, claiming it held special significance for us. I'd agreed, not because of sentimentality, but because I knew it would provide the perfect setting for what needed to happen next. The guest list had been carefully curated over the past month. David thought I was simply planning an elegant anniversary dinner, but every invitation had been strategic. My parents, Robert and Catherine Turner, prominent attorneys who'd built their practice on corporate litigation. My sister Jennifer, a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering financial fraud. David's business partners, including his mentor Harold Westbrook and his childhood friend Marcus Reed, both of whom had been asking increasingly pointed questions about Crawford Development's recent projects. The timing wasn't coincidental either. 3 days earlier, I'd received confirmation from my private investigator that Vanessa Crawford, David's ex-wife who'd kept his name despite their bitter divorce, had returned to Chicago. She'd been living in Miami for the past 3 years, supposedly building a new life after the explosive end of her marriage to David. What the investigator had discovered was far more interesting than a simple relocation story. Vanessa hadn't just returned to Chicago. She'd been secretly investing in properties throughout the city, properties that directly competed with Crawford Development's current projects. More intriguingly, she'd been using insider information about David's business dealings to make strategic purchases, information she could only have obtained through ongoing contact with someone inside the company. I'd spent months wondering who David's source was for the information that kept appearing in his competitors' hands. Properties. Crawford Development had been pursuing would mysteriously become unavailable just days before we planned to make offers. Zoning information that should have been confidential somehow reached rival firms weeks before public announcements. Investment opportunities that David had researched extensively would suddenly be snatched away by competitors who seemed to know exactly what to offer and when. The private investigator's report had provided the missing piece of a puzzle I'd been assembling for over a year. Vanessa wasn't just David's ex-wife seeking revenge. She was his current business partner, using their ongoing relationship to systematically undermine Crawford Development while building her own competing empire. The same woman who'd nearly destroyed our marriage 3 years ago had never actually left our lives. She'd simply become more strategic about her presence. But tonight, as I watched her approach our table with that calculating smile, I realized she'd made her first critical mistake. Vanessa had always been impulsive, dramatic, someone who couldn't resist making grand gestures. Her decision to crash. Our anniversary celebration wasn't just about causing a scene. It was about making a statement, reclaiming territory she'd never actually surrendered. What Vanessa didn't know was that I'd been expecting her. The investigation into David's business practices had begun innocently enough. 18 months ago, I'd noticed discrepancies in our household expenses that didn't align with David's reported business income. Credit card statements showing charges at restaurants where he claimed to be attending client meetings, but when I casually asked about his lunch companions, the details never quite matched. Hotel reservations in cities where Crawford Development had no active projects. Gas receipts that suggested driving patterns inconsistent with his stated schedule. Initially, I'd assumed David was having another affair. After discovering his relationship with Vanessa 3 years earlier, I'd developed an almost obsessive attention to detail regarding his behavior. Every late night at the office was scrutinized. Every business trip was verified through secondary sources. Every change in routine was documented and analyzed. But as the months passed, the pattern that emerged wasn't romantic infidelity. It was something far more complex and potentially devastating. David wasn't just cheating on our marriage. He was cheating his business partners, his clients, and possibly the federal government. The first concrete evidence came through my sister Jennifer, who'd been helping me understand some financial documents I'd found in David's home office. What I'd initially thought were routine business contracts turned out to be something called shadow partnerships, arrangements where Crawford Development would bid on properties using artificially low estimates, then create subsidiary companies to handle cost overruns that would be billed back to clients at massive markups. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Crawford Development would win contracts by significantly underbidding competitors, knowing that the real profits would come through the subsidiary work that clients couldn't avoid. Electrical systems that needed unexpected upgrades. Structural modifications that became necessary after construction began. Environmental compliance issues that required specialized remediation services. All of these subsidiary companies traced back to a complex web of shell corporations, and at the center of that web was a familiar name, Vanessa Crawford. David's supposedly estranged ex-wife was actually his primary business partner in what amounted to organized fraud on a massive scale. Jennifer had helped me understand the financial implications, but it was my conversation with Harold Westbrook that revealed the true scope of David's deception. Harold had been David's mentor since college, bringing him into the real estate business and eventually helping him start Crawford Development. Their relationship was both professional and paternal, which made Harold's concerns about recent business practices particularly significant. Harold had approached me 6 months ago at a charity fundraiser, ostensibly making small talk about David's success. But as the conversation progressed, I realized he was fishing for information about David's personal life, trying to understand changes in behavior that were affecting their business relationship. David had become secretive about major decisions, Harold explained, Projects that should have required board approval were being initiated without proper consultation. Financial arrangements that violated their partnership agreements were being implemented without discussion. Most troubling, David was making commitments to clients that Crawford Development couldn't possibly fulfill without the kind of cost overruns that were becoming their signature. Harold's concerns aligned perfectly with what I'd been discovering through my own investigation. David wasn't just running a successful business. He was running a sophisticated fraud operation that was systematically bilking clients while enriching, a network of shell companies controlled by his supposedly ex-wife. The conversation with Harold had been a turning point. Until that moment, I'd been conducting my investigation out of personal curiosity and marital suspicion, but Harold's revelations made clear that David's activities extended far beyond personal. Betrayal into criminal behavior that could destroy not just our marriage, but the lives and livelihoods of everyone connected to Crawford Development. That night, I'd made a decision that would define the next 18 months of my life. Instead of confronting David immediately, I would document everything. Every meeting, every financial transaction, every lie, every manipulation. I would build a case so comprehensive and irrefutable that when the moment came for revelation, there would be no possibility of denial or escape. The decision hadn't been easy. It meant continuing to live with a man I no longer trusted, pretending to believe his lies while systematically gathering evidence of his crimes. It meant smiling at dinner parties where he charmed potential victims. It meant attending business functions where he made promises I knew he couldn't keep. It meant playing the role of supportive wife while preparing to destroy the life we'd die. Built together. But it also meant protecting innocent people from David's schemes. Harold Westbrook, who'd trusted David like a son. Marcus Reed, who'd invested his family's savings in Crawford Development projects. The dozens of clients who believed they were working with an honest contractor. The employees whose jobs depended on a company that was essentially a criminal enterprise. Over the following months, I'd developed a routine that would have impressed any professional investigator. David's home office became my primary source of intelligence. His laptop, which he frequently left unlocked when working from home, provided access to email communications and financial records. His desk drawers, which he never bothered to secure, contained contracts and correspondence that revealed the true scope of his operations. I'd invested in equipment that would have seemed paranoid under different circumstances. A small digital camera that could photograph documents quickly and silently. Audio recording devices that could capture conversations from adjacent rooms. Software that could track computer usage and create copies of files without leaving digital fingerprints. The documentation process had become almost mechanical. Each evening, after David fell asleep, I would review and photograph any new materials in his office. Each morning, after he left for work, I would upload and organize the previous night's discoveries. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Each weekend, while David played golf or attended social functions, I would analyze patterns and cross-reference information with public records. Slowly, the full picture of David's operation began to emerge. Crawford Development was essentially 3 companies operating under one name. The public face was the legitimate construction business that Harold Westbrook believed he was part of. The hidden layer was the network of shell companies that generated most of the actual revenue through fraudulent billing practices. And the secret foundation was David's ongoing partnership with Vanessa, who provided strategic intelligence about competitors while building her own parallel empire. The relationship between David and Vanessa was far more complex than I'd initially understood. Their divorce 3 years earlier hadn't been the explosive end of a failed marriage. It had been a strategic restructuring that allowed them to operate more effectively while providing David with cover for his fraudulent activities. Vanessa's departure from Chicago hadn't been an escape from their toxic relationship. It had been a relocation to establish operations in new markets. The private investigators' reports from Miami revealed the scope of Vanessa's activities over the past 3 years. She'd established a real estate investment company that specialized in acquiring distressed properties, renovating them using contractors with suspicious ties to Chicago-based companies, then selling them at enormous profits to buyers who often turned out to be shell companies connected to Crawford development. The circular nature of their scheme was breathtaking. David would identify promising properties in Chicago, then share that information with Vanessa, who would use local intermediaries to acquire similar properties in Miami. Crawford Development would then invest in Miami projects that ultimately benefited Vanessa's companies, while Vanessa provided information that helped David outmaneuver competitors in Chicago. Both sides of the operation generated enormous profits while creating the appearance of legitimate business competition. But the most damaging discovery came 6 months ago, when I found evidence that David and Vanessa's scheme extended beyond simple fraud into potential money laundering. The shell companies weren't just hiding profits from business operations, they were cleaning money from sources that I couldn't identify, but which generated cash flows that dwarfed anything Crawford Development could produce through legitimate construction projects. That revelation had changed the stakes entirely. What I'd initially believed was marital infidelity and business fraud was actually something far more serious. David wasn't just cheating clients and partners. He was potentially involved with criminal organizations that used his real estate operations to legitimize illegal profits. The money laundering discovery had prompted me to expand my investigation beyond David's business activities into his personal relationships and social connections. The result was a network of associations that painted David as either a willing participant in organized crime or an incredibly naive business owner who'd been manipulated into providing services for people he should have avoided. The evidence suggested the former. David's business relationships included several individuals with documented connections to organized crime families. His social calendar included regular meetings with people whose primary source of income couldn't be explained through legitimate business activities. His financial records showed cash deposits and transfers that followed patterns consistent with money laundering operations. Most disturbing, David's communications with Vanessa included references to Chicago friends and Miami connections that seemed to involve people outside their real estate operations. The language was careful, almost coded, but the implications were clear. David and Vanessa weren't just defrauding construction clients. They were providing services for criminal organizations that needed to clean money through real estate transactions. By the time I received confirmation that Vanessa was returning to Chicago, I'd assembled a file that contained evidence of fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and potentially racketeering. The scope was overwhelming, but the documentation was meticulous. Every claim was supported by multiple sources. Every financial transaction was traced through multiple accounts. Every meeting was documented with dates, times, and participants. The question wasn't whether David was guilty of serious crimes. The question was how to handle that information in a way that protected innocent people while ensuring that justice was served. 3 weeks ago, I'd made the decision to contact federal authorities. Not directly, but through my father's law firm, which had extensive experience with white-collar crime cases. The approach was deliberately indirect, designed to provide law enforcement with information while protecting my identity until the appropriate moment for revelation. The FBI's response had been swift and professional. Within days, agents had begun their own investigation into Crawford Development's activities. The evidence I'd provided gave them probable cause for surveillance and financial analysis that quickly confirmed the scope of David's criminal enterprise. But federal investigations take time, and I'd realized that David and Vanessa's scheme was accelerating. The return to Chicago suggested they were planning something significant, possibly a major score that would allow them to disappear before law enforcement could act. That's when I'd decided to force their hand by planning our anniversary celebration. The event wasn't really about celebrating our marriage. It was about creating a controlled environment where David and Vanessa would feel compelled to make their move, revealing their intentions while federal agents documented everything from a safe distance. The guest list had been designed to maximize pressure on David. Harold Westbrook's presence would force David to maintain his facade as a legitimate businessman. Marcus Reed's attendance would remind David of the personal relationships he was betraying. My family's participation would create emotional pressure that might cause David to make mistakes. Most importantly, the public nature of the celebration would prevent David and Vanessa from having private conversations without being observed. Every interaction would be witnessed by people who could later testify about what they'd seen and heard. I'd known Vanessa would attend. The private investigators' reports had made clear that she couldn't resist dramatic confrontations, especially when she believed she held the advantage. Her decision to wear the same dress as me wasn't coincidental. It was a calculated insult, designed to humiliate me while demonstrating her continued influence over David. What Vanessa didn't realize was that her presence at our anniversary celebration would provide federal agents with evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. Her attendance at an event where she wasn't invited, wearing clothing designed to provoke confrontation, while meeting with her supposed ex-husband who was under federal investigation would be difficult to explain as coincidental social interaction. As I watched her approach our table, I felt a strange sense of calm. For 18 months, I'd been gathering evidence and building cases. Tonight, the confrontation phase would begin. Everything that happened from this moment forward would be documented by law enforcement agencies that were already building cases against both David and Vanessa. The champagne glass I'd dropped was being quietly cleaned up by hotel staff, but the crash had drawn attention from our guests. Conversations had paused as people noticed Vanessa's arrival and my obvious shock. David had turned to see what had caused the disturbance, and I watched his face transform from confusion to recognition to something approaching panic. For perhaps the first time in 3 years, David Crawford looked like a man who realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Vanessa reached our table with theatrical timing, her emerald dress catching the ballroom's crystal chandelier light in a way that was clearly intentional. She'd always understood how to make an entrance, how to command attention through careful staging and dramatic timing. But tonight, her performance would have an audience she hadn't anticipated. "Hello, David," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby tables could hear. "Sarah." She nodded in my direction with mock politeness. "I hope you don't mind my dropping by. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd offer my congratulations on your anniversary." The statement was absurd on multiple levels. Vanessa lived in Miami. Rosewood Manor wasn't in anyone's neighborhood unless they lived in one of Chicago's most exclusive areas. And offering congratulations on someone's wedding anniversary while wearing an identical dress was hardly a gesture of goodwill. But Vanessa's words weren't really directed at me. They were a message for David, a reminder that she could appear anywhere, anytime, disrupting his carefully constructed life whenever it suited her purposes. The dress was a declaration that she still considered herself Mrs. Crawford, regardless of divorce papers or current marital arrangements. David's response would determine how the rest of the evening proceeded. He could ask her to leave, acknowledging that her presence was inappropriate and uninvited. He could invite her to join us, revealing their ongoing relationship to our guests. Or he could attempt some middle ground that would satisfy no one while confirming everyone's suspicions about their continued connection. The choice would reveal more about David's character and intentions than any conversation we'd had in months. It would also provide federal agents with valuable intelligence about the nature of David and Vanessa's current relationship. As our guests watched expectantly, waiting to see how this drama would unfold, I realized that Vanessa's appearance had transformed our anniversary celebration into something entirely different. No longer a private dinner among friends, it had become a public confrontation that would determine the future of everyone in the room. The pieces I'd been carefully positioning for 18 months were finally in motion. The game, Vanessa thought, she was playing was actually a much larger contest with stakes she couldn't imagine, and the surprise I'd been preparing wasn't just for her arrival, but for the revelation that would change everything for everyone who'd been touched by David Crawford's crimes. The last year and a half of documentation, investigation, and strategic planning was about to be tested. Everything that happened next would determine whether justice would be served or whether David and Vanessa would continue their criminal enterprise with new victims in new cities. But as I looked around the room at the faces of people I cared about, people who trusted David and had invested their resources and reputations in his success, I felt confident that the surprise I'd prepared would be worth the wait. Vanessa Crawford had crashed our anniversary celebration, expecting to humiliate me and reclaim her territory. Instead, she'd walked into a carefully constructed trap that would finally give her exactly what she'd been waiting for: the full consequences of her choices. David's jaw tightened as he processed Vanessa's unexpected presence, his carefully rehearsed charm faltering for the first time all evening. I watched him struggle between competing impulses, the social pressure to maintain appearances warring against whatever private arrangements he'd made with his ex-wife. The silence stretched uncomfortably as our dinner guests shifted in their seats, sensing the undercurrent of tension that had suddenly transformed our celebration into something far more volatile. "Vanessa," David finally managed, his voice strained, with false civility. "This is quite a surprise. I thought you were still in Miami." The carefully neutral tone didn't fool anyone, least of all me. I'd heard David use that exact inflection countless times when dealing with difficult clients or problematic business situations. It was his default setting when buying time to assess potential damage and formulate responses. "Oh, I've been back for weeks," Vanessa replied with deliberate lightness, settling uninvited into the empty chair beside Harold Westbrook. "I'm surprised you haven't heard, but then again, you've always been so focused on your current projects." Her emphasis on current carried implications that only David and I would fully understand, but the message was clear to everyone present. Vanessa wasn't just David's past. She remained very much part of his present. Harold shifted uncomfortably as Vanessa made herself comfortable beside him, his weathered face betraying confusion and concern. At 72, Harold had seen enough business partnerships dissolve into personal animosity to recognize the warning signs of serious trouble. His protective instincts toward David had been evident for months, but tonight, I could see him beginning to question whether his loyalty had been misplaced. "Sarah," my sister Jennifer leaned closer, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Do you want me to handle this? I can have hotel security remove her for trespassing." Jennifer's offer wasn't entirely altruistic. As a forensic accountant, she'd developed an instinct for recognizing when personal drama intersected with professional malfeasance. Her presence tonight wasn't coincidental either. She'd been helping me understand the financial documents I'd been collecting, and her expertise had been invaluable in unraveling the complexity of David's schemes. I shook my head slightly, maintaining eye contact with Vanessa. Let's see what she has to say. The response wasn't bravado. Every moment Vanessa remained at our table provided additional evidence for the federal investigation that was already documenting this encounter. The recording devices I'd strategically placed throughout the venue were capturing every word, every gesture, every revelation that might emerge from this confrontation. The preparation for this moment had begun 3 months earlier when I'd first learned about Vanessa's planned return to Chicago. The private investigator's report had contained more than just confirmation of her presence in the city. It had revealed the scope of her current activities and the sophisticated network she'd built while supposedly rebuilding her life in Miami. Vanessa Crawford hadn't simply disappeared after her divorce from David. She'd relocated strategically, establishing operations in a market where her connection to Chicago real estate wouldn't immediately attract attention. But the business she'd built in Miami was far more complex than the investment company that appeared on public records. The investigator had traced Vanessa's financial activities through multiple shell companies and offshore accounts, revealing a pattern of property acquisitions that seemed almost prescient in their timing and targeting. Buildings she'd purchased months before development announcements, land acquisitions that preceded zoning changes by weeks, investment decisions that demonstrated access to information that should have been confidential. But the most revealing discovery had been Vanessa's travel patterns over the past 3 years. Public records showed her making regular trips between Miami and Chicago, trips that coincided perfectly with Crawford Development's major project announcements and contract signings. The woman who'd supposedly been erased from David's life had actually been maintaining closer contact than ever, just with better operational security. The financial connections between Vanessa's Miami operations and David's Chicago business were intricate enough to require forensic accounting expertise to unravel. Jennifer had spent weeks analyzing the documentation I'd provided, tracing money flows through networks of companies that existed primarily on paper. What she'd discovered was a sophisticated money laundering operation that used real estate transactions to clean profits from sources that remained deliberately obscured. The beauty of their system, Jennifer had explained during one of our clandestine meetings, is that real estate provides perfect cover for large cash transactions. Property values are subjective enough that inflated prices don't automatically trigger suspicion, and the industry attracts enough legitimate cash buyers that unusual payment methods blend into normal business patterns. But Jennifer's analysis had revealed patterns that were anything but normal. Properties purchased with cash at above market prices, then immediately resold to shell companies at significant losses. Renovation contracts that cost more than the original property purchases. Consulting fees that bore no relationship to actual services provided. The network of transactions created a web of financial activity that transformed questionable cash into legitimate business income. The sophistication of the operation had impressed even Jennifer, who'd built her career investigating corporate fraud. "This isn't amateur hour," she'd warned me. "David and Vanessa are either working with people who understand federal money laundering laws extremely well, or they've been very lucky. Given the amounts involved, I'd bet on the former." The amounts were staggering. Over 3 years, the combined operations had processed tens of millions of dollars through real estate transactions that appeared legitimate on the surface, but became obviously fraudulent under detailed analysis. The scale suggested involvement with criminal organizations that generated cash flows requiring sophisticated laundering operations. That realization had prompted me to expand my investigation beyond David's business activities into his personal associations and social connections. The results had been disturbing. David's calendar included regular meetings with individuals whose primary businesses couldn't be determined through public records. His phone logs showed frequent contact with people who seemed to exist only on the periphery of legitimate society. His financial records contained payments to companies that provided no discernible services. Most concerning were David's recent trips to cities where Crawford Development had no active projects, but where Vanessa's Miami companies had suddenly begun acquiring properties: Las Vegas, Phoenix, Atlanta, Tampa. In each location, David would spend 2 or 3 days ostensibly exploring expansion opportunities. Within weeks of his visits, Vanessa's companies would announce major property acquisitions in those same markets. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. David wasn't just sharing information with Vanessa about Chicago opportunities. He was actively scouting new markets for their expanding operations, possibly at the direction of people who provided the capital that made their rapid growth possible. The private investigator had attempted to identify David's mysterious business associates, but the results had been frustratingly incomplete. Names that appeared in David's appointment calendars couldn't be verified through standard background checks. Phone numbers traced to burner devices or answering services. Business addresses that led to empty offices or mail forwarding services. The deliberate opacity suggested that David's associates understood surveillance and took precautions against investigation. These weren't naive businessmen who'd stumbled into questionable arrangements. They were professionals who operated with the kind of operational security typically associated with organized crime. That assessment had led to my decision to involve federal authorities. The evidence I'd collected suggested violations of multiple federal statutes, including money laundering, fraud, and potentially racketeering. But the sophistication of the operation and the apparent involvement of organized crime made it inappropriate for local law enforcement to handle. My father's law firm had provided the perfect avenue for approaching federal authorities without exposing my identity prematurely. Robert Turner's reputation for handling white-collar crime cases had given him extensive contacts within the FBI and other federal agencies. His initial approach had been deliberately vague, describing a potential corporate fraud case without identifying specific individuals or companies. The FBI's response had been swift and professional. Within days, agents had requested a meeting to review the evidence and assess the scope of potential criminal activity. The materials I'd compiled over 18 months had provided them with more than enough justification for opening a formal investigation. Special Agent Maria Gonzalez had been assigned as the primary investigator, bringing 15 years of experience with financial crimes and organized crime investigations. Her initial assessment of David and Vanessa's operations had been unambiguous. "This isn't just fraud," she'd explained during our first meeting. "This is a RICO case. Money laundering, fraud, potentially extortion if they're pressuring clients to use their overpriced services. The scope suggests organized crime involvement." Agent Gonzalez had explained that federal investigations of organized crime operations required extensive surveillance and documentation before arrests could be made. The goal wasn't just to catch individual criminals, but to dismantle entire networks and identify all participants. That process could take months or even years, depending on the complexity of the organization. But the timing of Vanessa's return to Chicago had created an opportunity to accelerate the investigation. Her presence in the city would likely trigger increased activity as she coordinated with David and their associates. The FBI had requested my assistance in creating situations where David and Vanessa would feel compelled to meet and communicate, providing agents with opportunities to document their interactions. The anniversary celebration had been my suggestion. The public nature of the event would prevent David and Vanessa from having extended private conversations, forcing them to communicate in ways that could be observed and recorded. The presence of David's business associates and potential victims would provide additional witnesses to their interactions. Most importantly, the celebration would create emotional pressure that might cause David to make mistakes. After 3 years of marriage, I understood his psychological patterns well enough to predict how he'd respond to Vanessa's dramatic appearance. His need to maintain control and project success would conflict with his desire to protect his secrets, creating cognitive dissonance that could lead to revealing statements or actions. The preparation for tonight had involved more than just planning the guest list and venue logistics. Agent Gonzalez had worked with me to ensure that every aspect of the evening would provide maximum intelligence value while maintaining the appearance of a normal social event. The venue had been chosen partially for its technical capabilities. Rosewood Manor's ballroom contained multiple locations where surveillance equipment could be discreetly positioned without attracting attention. The hotel's security system provided additional coverage that could be accessed by federal agents without alerting David or Vanessa to their presence. The timing had been coordinated to ensure that federal surveillance teams would be in position before guests arrived. The invitation list had been reviewed to identify individuals who might have knowledge of David's criminal activities. Even the menu had been selected to encourage alcohol consumption that might loosen tongues and lower inhibitions. My own preparation had been equally thorough. The dress I'd chosen wasn't just elegant. It contained multiple concealed recording devices that would capture conversations even if participants moved away from fixed surveillance positions. My jewelry included a GPS tracker that would allow agents to monitor my location throughout the evening. My purse contained backup recording equipment and a panic button that would summon immediate federal response if the situation became dangerous. The months of preparation had also included extensive briefings on how to handle various scenarios that might emerge during the confrontation. Agent Gonzalez had coached me on techniques for encouraging self-incriminating statements without appearing to interrogate. FBI behavioral analysts had provided guidance on reading body language and recognizing signs of deception or aggression. Most importantly, the federal team had developed contingency plans for protecting my safety if the evening spiraled out of control. Undercover agents would be present throughout the venue, ready to intervene if David or Vanessa became threatening. Backup teams were positioned outside the hotel, prepared to arrest both suspects if immediate action became necessary. But the hope was that tonight would provide intelligence rather than arrests. The goal was to gather enough evidence to ensure that when charges were finally filed, the cases would be airtight and comprehensive. That meant allowing David and Vanessa enough rope to hang themselves while documenting every detail of their criminal enterprise. As I watched Vanessa settle into her uninvited seat, I felt a familiar mix of anticipation and anxiety. For 18 months, I'd been gathering evidence and building cases. Tonight, the documentation phase would transition into active intelligence gathering. Everything that happened from this moment forward would contribute to the federal case that would ultimately bring down David's criminal empire. The champagne stain on the marble floor had been cleaned up, but the symbolic damage had been done. Vanessa's dramatic entrance had shattered the careful facade David had constructed around our marriage and his business success. Now the question was whether he would attempt to maintain that facade or abandon it entirely in favor of damage control. Harold Westbrook cleared his throat diplomatically, attempting to restore some semblance of normal conversation. "Vanessa, I must say you look lovely this evening. That's quite a striking dress." His comment was polite but pointed, acknowledging the obvious similarities between Vanessa's attire and mine without directly addressing the implied insult. "Thank you, Harold," Vanessa replied with practiced sweetness. "You know how much I've always admired Sarah's taste. I just couldn't resist finding something similar when I saw this in the boutique window." The explanation was obviously false. Designer dresses like the one we were both wearing weren't available off the rack. Vanessa had clearly commissioned an identical copy, which suggested she'd known about my dress selection well in advance of tonight. That knowledge could only have come from David, confirming their ongoing communication despite his repeated assurances that Vanessa was completely out of our lives. The dress coordination wasn't just a fashion statement. It was evidence of conspiracy. Proof that David and Vanessa had planned this confrontation together. Marcus Reed, David's childhood friend and business partner, leaned forward with barely concealed irritation. "Vanessa, with all due respect, this is David and Sarah's anniversary celebration. Perhaps we could save the catch-up conversation for another time?" Marcus had invested significant family money in Crawford development projects, and his protective instincts toward David were being challenged by growing concerns about recent business decisions. "Of course," Vanessa agreed with mock contrition. "I certainly wouldn't want to intrude on such a special occasion. I just wanted to offer my congratulations and perhaps share some exciting news about my return to Chicago. David, I think you'll be particularly interested in some of the opportunities I've discovered since coming back." The statement was carefully crafted to sound innocent while conveying multiple layers of meaning. To our guests, it appeared to be polite social conversation about business opportunities. To David, it was a clear signal that Vanessa had information or proposals that required immediate attention. To federal agents monitoring our conversation, it was evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. David's response would reveal how much control he still maintained over their partnership and whether he was prepared to risk exposure by engaging with Vanessa publicly. His decision would also indicate whether he understood the danger their association posed to his carefully constructed legitimate persona. "I'm sure you've found Chicago quite changed since you left," David replied carefully. his tone neutral enough to avoid either encouraging or discouraging further conversation. The real estate market has certainly evolved in interesting directions. The response was diplomatically non-committal, but it confirmed that David understood Vanessa's references to business opportunities. My father, who'd been observing the exchange with the analytical eye of an experienced attorney, chose that moment to intervene. "Vanessa, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Robert Turner, Sarah's father." His interruption wasn't accidental. As someone who'd spent decades handling corporate fraud cases, he'd recognized the subtext of the conversation and was positioning himself to gather additional intelligence. "Of course, Mr. Turner," Vanessa responded with renewed charm. "I've heard so much about your legal practice. David speaks of you often, particularly your expertise with complex business arrangements." The comment was seemingly innocent, but it revealed that David discussed my family's professional activities with Vanessa, further evidence of their ongoing relationship. "I appreciate the kind words," my father replied smoothly. "Though I'm curious about your own business interests. David mentioned you'd established quite a successful operation in Miami. Real estate investment, if I recall correctly?" The question was posed with lawyerly precision, designed to elicit specific information while appearing to make casual conversation. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly as she recognized the probing nature of my father's inquiry. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed to realize that this wasn't just a social gathering of David's friends and family. The guest list included people with professional expertise in areas that could pose threats to her operations. "Yes, I've been fortunate to identify some excellent opportunities in the Miami market," she replied cautiously. "Though I'm finding that Chicago offers even more interesting possibilities for someone with the right connections and experience." The response was deliberately vague, but it confirmed her intention to resume operations in Chicago while suggesting that those operations would involve people David had introduced her to. Jennifer, who'd been listening to the exchange with professional interest, decided to contribute her own subtle interrogation. "That's fascinating, Vanessa. As someone who works in financial analysis, I'm always curious about investment strategies in different markets. Have you found that property values in Miami follow similar patterns to Chicago, or are there significant differences in how investments perform?" The question appeared to be innocent professional curiosity, but Jennifer was actually probing for information about Vanessa's financial activities and investment methodologies. Any detailed answer would provide insights into her operations while potentially revealing knowledge that could only have come from insider information. Vanessa hesitated, clearly recognizing that she was being questioned by people with relevant, professional expertise. The social pressure to provide substantive answers conflicted with her need to protect operational security. Her response would indicate whether she understood the sophistication of the investigation she'd walked into. "Well," she began slowly, "I've found that success in any market depends primarily on having access to accurate information and reliable partnerships. Miami certainly taught me the value of maintaining strong professional relationships across multiple markets." The answer was evasive but revealing, confirming that her success depended on information sharing and multi-market operations. David's discomfort was becoming increasingly apparent as the conversation continued. His initial hope that Vanessa's appearance could be managed through polite social maneuvering was being challenged by the professional expertise of our guests. Every question revealed additional details about Vanessa's operations while confirming their ongoing relationship. Agent Gonzalez had predicted this scenario during our planning sessions. Vanessa's ego and need for recognition would compel her to discuss her success, but her criminal activities would require her to be evasive about specifics. The contradiction would create cognitive dissonance that might lead to inconsistent statements or revealing admissions. "Relationships are certainly crucial in real estate," Harold agreed, his mentor's instincts causing him to probe deeper into what he was hearing. David has always emphasized the importance of maintaining trust with partners and clients. I imagine that's even more critical when operating across multiple markets with different regulatory environments. The comment was pointed enough to suggest that Harold was beginning to question whether David's recent business practices aligned with the ethical standards he'd been taught. The mention of regulatory environments was particularly significant, given the money laundering implications of multi-market operations. Vanessa glanced at David, apparently seeking guidance on how much information she should reveal to his mentor and business partners. The look was brief but unmistakable, confirming their coordination while revealing that David maintained some level of authority over their joint operations. Regulatory compliance is certainly important, Vanessa agreed. Carefully, though I've found that creative approaches to structuring transactions can provide significant advantages while remaining within appropriate legal boundaries. The statement was technically accurate but misleading, describing criminal money laundering as creative transaction structuring. The evening was proceeding exactly as Agent Gonzalez had predicted. Vanessa's need to project success and sophistication was causing her to reveal operational details while attempting to make those revelations sound legitimate. David's attempts to manage the conversation were being frustrated by guests who possessed professional expertise in areas relevant to their criminal activities. Most importantly, every statement was being recorded by multiple surveillance systems that would provide federal prosecutors with evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. Vanessa's presence at our anniversary celebration, combined with her admissions about multi-market operations and creative transaction structuring, would be difficult to explain as innocent social conversation. The trap I'd been setting for 18 months was finally beginning to close around its intended targets. But the evening was far from over, and Vanessa's most damaging revelations were yet to come. The moment of truth arrived when David's phone buzzed against the table, the vibration audible in the suddenly tense silence that had fallen over our anniversary dinner. His eyes darted to the screen, and I watched his face drain of color as he read whatever message had just arrived. The carefully maintained composure he'd been projecting all evening cracked visibly, revealing the panic that had been simmering beneath his polished exterior. Vanessa noticed his reaction immediately, her predatory instincts honed by years of reading David's emotional tells. "Is everything all right, darling?" she asked with mock concern, the endearment deliberately chosen to provoke both David and me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." David's hand trembled slightly as he set the phone face down on the white linen tablecloth, but not before I caught a glimpse of the sender's name. Agent Rodriguez, the federal contact whose existence David believed was still secret from me. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. David thought he was receiving a warning about federal investigation, when in reality, Agent Gonzalez's team was using his own informant to feed him information designed to force exactly this kind of reaction. "Just a business matter," David muttered, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow." But his body language betrayed the lie. His shoulders had tensed, his breathing had become shallow, and his eyes kept darting between Vanessa and the exit, as if calculating escape routes. Harold Westbrook leaned forward with grandfatherly concern. "David, you've been quite distracted lately. Is there something troubling you about the company? If there are problems, perhaps we should discuss them privately." Harold's offer was genuine, stemming from decades of mentoring relationships, but it represented exactly the kind of scrutiny David had been desperately trying to avoid. "Everything's fine, Harold," David insisted, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Just the usual pressures of expansion. You know how demanding growth can be." The explanation was technically true, but fundamentally misleading, describing criminal expansion as legitimate business growth. Vanessa's eyes glittered with malicious amusement as she watched David struggle to maintain his facade. She understood better than anyone the pressure he was under, having helped create many of the situations that were now threatening to expose him. But rather than offering support, she seemed determined to increase his discomfort. "Oh, I'm sure. "Growth brings all sorts of interesting challenges," she said with false sympathy, "especially when you're working with new partners in unfamiliar territories. Miami taught me so much about adapting to different business environments and regulatory frameworks." Her words were carefully chosen to sound supportive, while actually threatening to reveal more about their joint operations. My father's legal instincts were clearly triggered by the undercurrents he was observing. "Regulatory frameworks can indeed be challenging," he agreed thoughtfully, "particularly when business activities cross state lines or involve complex financial structures. I imagine someone with Vanessa's multi-market experience has valuable insights about compliance requirements." The comment was designed to probe deeper into Vanessa's operations while appearing to make casual conversation. But David recognized the danger immediately. His face went from pale to flushed as he realized that my father was conducting an impromptu, legal interrogation disguised as dinner conversation. "Robert, I appreciate your interest," David said with forced joviality, "but I think we're getting a bit too deep into business talk for an anniversary celebration. Perhaps we could save the professional discussions for another time." His attempt to redirect the conversation was obvious to everyone at the table, confirming that he had something to hide about his business practices. Jennifer chose that moment to deliver what she'd been preparing all evening. "Actually, David, I've been meaning to ask you about some interesting patterns I've noticed in Crawford Development's recent financial filings. As someone who specializes in forensic accounting, I couldn't help but notice some unusual transaction structures that might benefit from professional review." The statement hit David like a physical blow. His coffee cup rattled against its saucer as his hand shook, and, for a moment, he looked like he might actually bolt from the table. Jennifer's expertise in forensic accounting was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid, and her casual mention of unusual transaction structures suggested she'd already identified problems with his operations. "I'm not sure what you mean," David stammered, his composure completely abandoned now. "Crawford Development follows all standard accounting practices. We have excellent CPAs who handle all our financial reporting." The defensive response only confirmed that Jennifer had hit her target accurately. "Oh, I'm sure you do," Jennifer replied with professional detachment. "But sometimes external review can identify optimization opportunities that internal accountants might miss, particularly when dealing with complex multi-entity structures or intercompany transactions." Her language was deliberately technical, but everyone at the table understood she was describing exactly the kind of financial arrangements that typically concealed fraudulent activities. Vanessa's amusement at David's discomfort was becoming increasingly obvious. She seemed to be enjoying his panic, apparently believing that his exposure would somehow benefit her own position. But her entertainment was about to be interrupted by revelations that would shatter her own sense of security. My mother, who'd been quietly observing the evening's dynamics with the analytical skills of a veteran trial attorney's wife, decided to contribute her own subtle pressure. "Vanessa, dear, I'm curious about your decision to return to Chicago. After building such a successful business in Miami, what drew you back to a market you'd left behind?" The question appeared innocent, but it was actually probing for information about Vanessa's motivations and timeline. Any honest answer would reveal planning and preparation that contradicted her claims about spontaneous business opportunities. Any dishonest answer would provide evidence of deception that could be used against her later. Vanessa hesitated, clearly recognizing that she was being questioned by people with relevant professional expertise. Her earlier confidence was beginning to waver as she realized that this wasn't just a social gathering where she could manipulate the conversation through charm and drama. "Well," she began carefully, "I suppose I missed the energy of Chicago's market. Miami was wonderful for learning, but Chicago offers opportunities for someone with the right connections and experience." The answer was evasive, confirming that her return involved pre-existing relationships rather than new business development. Marcus Reed, who'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the entire evening, finally voiced his concerns directly. "David, I have to ask, Is there something going on that the rest of us should know about? The way you've been acting lately, the secretive meetings, the sudden changes in project management. As your partner and friend, I'm worried about you." Marcus's direct confrontation represented David's worst nightmare. His childhood friend and business partner was publicly questioning his behavior in front of his mentor, his family, and his ex-wife. The social pressure to provide explanations was overwhelming, but any honest answer would expose criminal activities that could destroy everyone connected to Crawford development. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern," David replied desperately. "But you're reading too much into normal business evolution. Yes, I've been exploring new opportunities and partnerships, but that's how companies grow. You know that." The explanation was weak and defensive, confirming Marcus's suspicions rather than alleviating them. "New partnerships with whom?" Marcus pressed, his concern overriding social politeness. "Because I've been asking questions around town and nobody seems to know anything about these mysterious new clients you keep mentioning. And the financial performance doesn't match the revenue projections you've been sharing with the board." David's eyes darted to Vanessa, apparently seeking support or guidance, but she was watching the confrontation with detached interest, as if it were entertainment rather than a crisis that threatened them both. Her reaction confirmed that she viewed David as expendable, someone whose exposure might actually benefit her own operations. The realization that Vanessa wasn't going to support him seemed to trigger something desperate in David. "Look," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I understand everyone's concerns, but this isn't the time or place for a business inquisition. We're supposed to be celebrating our anniversary, not conducting an audit of my company." His attempt to reclaim control of the situation only emphasized how completely he'd lost it. The mention of audits was particularly unfortunate, given Jennifer's presence and expertise. Harold's expression had shifted from concern to disappointment, recognizing that his protégé was hiding something serious. My parents exchanged meaningful looks that suggested they were prepared to provide whatever legal support might become necessary. But it was Vanessa who delivered the most devastating blow to David's remaining credibility. Perhaps motivated by his failure to protect her interests, or simply unable to resist the opportunity to demonstrate her power over him, she chose that moment to reveal information that David had desperately wanted to keep secret. "Oh, David," she said with false sympathy, "I think your friends deserve to know the truth about our business relationship. After all, transparency is so important in partnerships." The statement was a direct threat, warning David that she was prepared to expose their joint operations if he continued to distance himself from her publicly. David's face went ashen as he recognized the implications of Vanessa's threat. "Vanessa, I don't think this is the appropriate forum for business discussions," he said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation privately at a more suitable time." "But why would we need privacy?" Vanessa asked with mock innocence. "Surely there's nothing inappropriate about discussing legitimate business partnerships. Unless, of course, there's something about our arrangements that might concern your other partners." The implicit threat was unmistakable. Vanessa was prepared to expose their criminal activities unless David submitted to her demands. Harold's business instincts were clearly alarmed by what he was witnessing. "David, if there are business relationships that affect Crawford development, I think the board has a right to know about them. We've been partners for 15 years. I deserve to understand what's happening with the company I helped you build." The pressure from Harold was clearly devastating to David. His mentor's disappointment was visible, and the realization that he'd betrayed someone who'd trusted him completely seemed to break something fundamental in his psychological defenses. "Harold, I never meant for things to get so complicated," David began, his voice cracking with emotion. "It started as a simple opportunity to expand into new markets, but then the arrangements became more complex, and before I knew it, I was committed to partnerships that I couldn't easily explain or exit." The admission was partial but damaging, confirming that David had entered into secret business relationships that he'd concealed from his board and partners. While he hadn't explicitly confessed to criminal activity, his statement established a pattern of deception that would support more serious charges. Jennifer recognized the significance of David's admission immediately. "David, when you say the arrangements became complex, are you referring to financial structures that might require specialized legal or accounting review? Because complexity often indicates regulatory compliance issues that need professional attention." David's response would determine whether he understood the legal jeopardy he was creating for himself. Any detailed explanation would likely reveal criminal activities. Any refusal to explain would confirm that he was hiding something serious. Either way, his credibility with his business partners and family was being systematically destroyed. "I think," David said slowly, "that I should probably consult with my attorney before discussing specific business arrangements in detail." The invocation of legal counsel was essentially an admission that his activities raised legal concerns, devastating his remaining credibility while providing evidence of consciousness of guilt. Vanessa's reaction to David's legal caution was immediate and hostile. "Oh, David, surely you're not suggesting that our perfectly legitimate business relationship requires legal protection? That would imply something inappropriate about our arrangements, wouldn't it?" Her challenge was calculated to force David into either denying the need for legal counsel, which would expose him to continued interrogation, or confirming it, which would imply criminal activity. Either choice would damage his position while providing federal agents with additional evidence. The trap that Agent Gonzalez and I had designed was working exactly as intended. David and Vanessa were being forced to choose between protecting themselves individually or maintaining their conspiracy. The pressure was causing them to make statements that revealed the nature of their relationship while documenting their consciousness of guilt. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "David, I think I need to call an emergency board meeting. Based on what I'm hearing tonight, there are serious questions about Crawford developments, operations that require immediate investigation." His decision to demand formal review represented the collapse of David's support network and the beginning of official scrutiny he'd been desperately trying to avoid. "Marcus, please," David pleaded, "don't make hasty decisions based on incomplete information. Yes, there are complex business arrangements that require careful explanation, but that doesn't mean anything inappropriate has occurred. Give me a chance to provide proper documentation and context before taking drastic action." But Marcus was beyond persuasion. "David, you've been my friend since childhood, and I've trusted you with my family's financial future. If there are business arrangements so complex that they require legal counsel to discuss, then I need independent professional review to protect my interests and those of our other investors." Harold nodded gravely in agreement with Marcus's position. "I'm afraid I have to support Marcus's request for formal review. David, you've been like a son to me, but my fiduciary responsibilities to our investors require me to ensure that all business activities are properly disclosed and legally compliant." The defection of both Harold and Marcus represented the complete collapse of David's support network within Crawford Development. Without their backing, he lacked the authority to prevent the kind of investigation that would inevitably expose his criminal activities. Vanessa watched David's professional destruction with apparent satisfaction, apparently believing that his exposure would somehow insulate her from consequences. But her complacency was about to be shattered by revelations that would demonstrate how thoroughly federal agents had penetrated their operations. Agent Gonzalez had warned me that this moment would be critical. David's isolation from his support network would force him to choose between accepting responsibility for his crimes or attempting to shift blame to Vanessa and their mysterious associates. Either choice would provide valuable intelligence about the broader criminal organization. David's phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't hide his reaction as he read the message. His face went completely white. and his hands began to shake visibly. The communication was apparently devastating, enough to override his remaining self-control. "I need to leave," he announced suddenly, standing so abruptly that his chair toppled backward. "There's an emergency that requires immediate attention. Sarah, we'll discuss this situation when I return." His attempt to flee was obvious to everyone present, confirming guilt while abandoning any pretense of innocence. But Vanessa wasn't going to allow David to escape without her. "Oh, I think I should come with you," she said sweetly, rising from her own chair. "After all, if there's an emergency affecting our business interests, I should be involved in addressing it." Her insistence on accompaniment was apparently motivated by fear that David might sacrifice her interests to protect himself. The moment I'd been waiting 18 months for had finally arrived. David and Vanessa were preparing to leave together, providing federal agents with evidence of ongoing conspiracy, while revealing their shared culpability for whatever crisis had triggered David's panic. But before they could escape, I had one final revelation that would demonstrate how completely their operations had been compromised. The surprise I'd been preparing wasn't just about exposing their crimes to our dinner guests. It was about revealing that every aspect of their criminal enterprise had been documented by federal authorities who were already building cases against them. "David," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over our table. "Before you leave, there's something I think you should know." The calmness of my tone was deliberately contrasted with the chaos they'd created, suggesting that I possessed information they lacked. David froze halfway to the exit, apparently recognizing something in my voice that warned of additional danger. Vanessa stopped beside him, her eyes narrowing as she tried to assess this new threat to their plans. "The emergency you're responding to," I continued, "isn't really an emergency at all. It's a carefully orchestrated conclusion to an investigation that's been documenting your activities for the past 18 months. Every meeting, every financial transaction, every attempt to conceal your criminal enterprise has been recorded and analyzed by federal agents who are already preparing charges against both of you." The revelation hit them like physical blows. David staggered slightly, grabbing the back of his chair for support. Vanessa's facade of confident control cracked completely, revealing the fear and desperation beneath her polished exterior. "That's impossible," David whispered, his voice barely audible. "There's no way you could have known about our arrangements. We were careful. We used secure communications and protected financial structures." "You were careful," I agreed, "but not careful enough. Every precaution you took was anticipated and circumvented by people with far more experience in investigating criminal organizations than you have in running them." The confirmation that federal authorities possessed comprehensive evidence of their activities was designed to force decisions about cooperation versus resistance. Vanessa's reaction was immediate and hostile. "You conniving bitch!" she snarled, her polished facade completely abandoned. "You've been spying on us, haven't you? Playing the innocent wife while gathering information like some kind of federal informant." Her accusation was accurate, but self-incriminating, confirming the existence of activities that required surveillance. "I've been protecting innocent people from the consequences of your crimes," I replied evenly, "including everyone at this table who trusted David with their investments and reputations. The only reason you're not in handcuffs right now is that federal agents wanted to give you both an opportunity to make intelligent decisions about cooperation." David's phone buzzed again, and this time he looked at it with the expression of a condemned man reading his execution order. "They want me to surrender voluntarily," he said in a hollow voice. "They're offering to negotiate if I come in immediately, with legal counsel." The offer of negotiation was actually part of Agent Gonzalez's strategy to separate David and Vanessa, encouraging them to compete for favorable plea arrangements rather than maintaining their conspiracy. The prospect of individual deals would break down their mutual loyalty and encourage them to provide information about their broader criminal network. Vanessa grabbed David's arm possessively. "Don't even think about it," she hissed. "They can't prove anything concrete. Everything we've done can be explained as legitimate business activities. We just need to maintain our story and refuse to be intimidated." But David was beyond intimidation now. He was facing the collapse of everything he'd built, both legitimate and criminal. The choice between accepting responsibility and attempting to fight federal charges with unlimited resources was really no choice at all. "Vanessa," he said wearily, "it's over. Sarah's right. We've been completely exposed, and continuing to resist will only make things worse for everyone involved." His acceptance of defeat represented the final collapse of their criminal partnership. The confrontation that had begun with Vanessa's dramatic entrance was ending with both perpetrators facing the consequences of 18 months of criminal activity. The surprise I'd prepared had delivered exactly what Vanessa had been waiting for: the complete destruction of the fantasy that she and David could continue their crimes indefinitely. But the evening wasn't quite finished. There were still revelations to come that would demonstrate the full scope of federal penetration into their operations, and consequences that would extend far beyond David and Vanessa to the broader criminal network they'd been serving. The trap had been sprung, but the investigation it had been designed to support was just beginning. The federal agents materialized from the shadows of Rosewood Manor's ornate hallways like ghosts becoming flesh, their presence transforming our intimate anniversary dinner into the climactic scene of an elaborate sting operation. Agent Gonzalez led the procession, her badge gleaming under the crystal chandeliers as she approached our table with the measured confidence of someone who'd orchestrated this moment down to the smallest detail. "David Crawford, Vanessa Crawford, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering, wire fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act," Agent Gonzalez announced, her voice carrying the weight of 18 months of meticulous investigation. The formal language of the charges seemed to echo in the suddenly silent ballroom, each syllable hammering home the reality that David and Vanessa's criminal empire was finally collapsing. David's legs gave out completely, and he collapsed back into his chair as if the words had physically struck him. The confident real estate mogul who'd charmed investors and clients for years was gone, replaced by a trembling man who suddenly looked far older than his 42 years. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, presumably to call his attorney. But Agent Gonzalez gently removed the device from his grasp. "You'll have access to legal counsel at the appropriate time, Mr. Crawford," she explained professionally. "Right now, we need to secure both of you and preserve any evidence that might be on your persons or in your immediate possession." Her tone was firm, but not unkind, reflecting the Federal Bureau's preference for professional conduct even during dramatic arrests. Vanessa's reaction was characteristically different from David's capitulation. She drew herself up to her full height, her emerald dress suddenly seeming more like armor than evening wear, and fixed Agent Gonzalez with a glare that could have melted steel. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she declared, her voice carrying enough volume to ensure that every guest in the ballroom could hear her protests. "I have no idea what David's been involved in, but I'm certainly not part of any criminal conspiracy." The denial was exactly what Agent Gonzalez had predicted during our planning sessions. Vanessa's ego would prevent her from accepting responsibility, and her immediate instinct would be to distance herself from David while portraying herself as an innocent victim of his schemes. But the federal investigation had been designed to anticipate exactly this response. "Mrs. Crawford," Agent Gonzalez replied with practiced patience, "we have extensive documentation of your involvement in multi-state money laundering operations, including recorded conversations, financial records, and surveillance footage from multiple jurisdictions. Your cooperation would be appreciated, but your denial is neither surprising nor particularly relevant to the charges you're facing." As additional agents moved to secure David and Vanessa, I found myself observing our dinner guests' reactions, with a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. Harold Westbrook sat frozen in his chair, his face reflecting the profound betrayal he felt at discovering that his protégé had been systematically deceiving him for years. The man who dedicated decades to mentoring young professionals was confronting the reality that his greatest success story had been built on criminal foundations. Marcus Reed appeared equally devastated, but his reaction was more focused on practical concerns than emotional betrayal. As someone who'd invested significant family resources in Crawford development projects, he was already calculating the financial implications of David's arrest. His wife and children's security depended on investments that might now be considered proceeds of criminal activity, subject to forfeiture and legal complications that could destroy their family's stability. My parents maintained their professional composure, drawing on decades of experience with high-stakes legal situations. My father was already making mental notes about witness testimony and evidence preservation, while my mother observed the agent's conduct with the analytical eye of someone who'd seen countless arrests during her husband's career. Jennifer was practically vibrating with excitement, her forensic accountant's instincts thrilled by the opportunity to witness the culmination of such a complex financial investigation. But it was the broader implications of the evening that occupied my thoughts, as federal agents began the process of formally arresting David and Vanessa. The collapse of their criminal enterprise would reverberate through Chicago's real estate industry for months, potentially years. Dozens of legitimate businesses that had unknowingly provided services to their operations would face scrutiny. Hundreds of employees whose jobs depended on Crawford Development's success would need to find new employment. Thousands of clients who'd trusted David with their most significant investments would discover that their projects had been vehicles for criminal activity. Agent Gonzalez approached me as her colleagues handled the arrest procedures, her expression conveying both professional satisfaction and personal respect for the role I'd played in bringing David and Vanessa to justice. "Mrs. Crawford, I want to thank you for your cooperation throughout this investigation. Your documentation and intelligence gathering were instrumental in building the case we'll be presenting to federal prosecutors." The acknowledgement felt surreal after 18 months of secret meetings, clandestine document photography, and careful evidence preservation. The woman who'd been dismissed by her husband as an uninformed housewife had actually been the key to unraveling one of Chicago's most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's condescending attitude toward my intelligence had been one of his greatest strategic mistakes. "What happens next?" I asked, genuinely curious about the legal processes that would unfold now that arrests had been made. The investigation phase was complete, but the prosecution and potential trials represented an entirely different set of challenges and complications. "Both suspects will be processed and arraigned within the next 24 hours, Agent Gonzalez explained. "Given the complexity of the charges and the flight risk they represent, we'll be requesting detention pending trial. The evidence you helped us gather will be presented to a federal grand jury, which will determine the specific charges they'll face." She paused, glancing toward David and Vanessa as they were being fitted with handcuffs by other agents. "I should warn you that this process could take months or even years to complete. RICO cases are particularly complex, and if they choose to fight the charges rather than accept plea agreements, you may be called to testify about your observations and the evidence you collected." The prospect of testifying against David in federal court was both daunting and oddly liberating. For years, I'd been forced to remain silent about his increasingly erratic behavior and questionable business practices. The opportunity to tell the complete truth under oath, with legal protections against retaliation, represented a form of vindication I'd never imagined possible. David was being led away from our table when he turned back toward me with an expression of such profound betrayal and rage that several agents immediately moved to ensure he couldn't approach me. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Our marriage, my company, my reputation. All of it gone because you couldn't trust me to handle my own business affairs." The accusation was so fundamentally disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. David genuinely seemed to believe that his criminal activities were simply business affairs that didn't concern me, despite the fact that his fraud had put our home, our finances, and my personal safety at risk. His inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his choices was perhaps the most revealing aspect of his character. "David," I replied calmly, "I didn't destroy anything. You built your success on criminal activity that was always destined to collapse. The only choice I made was whether to be a victim of that collapse or to help minimize the damage to innocent people." My response was designed to be heard by the federal agents who would be documenting this interaction, but it was also genuinely how I felt about the situation. Vanessa's reaction to being arrested was characteristically more dramatic than David's: resigned acceptance. As agents began to escort her toward the ballroom's exit, she twisted in their grasp to deliver what she clearly intended to be a devastating final statement. "Sarah, you pathetic little mouse," she snarled, her composed facade completely abandoned. "You think you've won something here, but you've just destroyed your own life along with ours. Who do you think is going to want anything to do with the woman who betrayed her own husband to federal agents?" The insult was intended to wound, but it actually provided me with a profound sense of closure. For 3 years, Vanessa had represented everything I feared about myself. Her confidence, her sexuality, her apparent ability to command David's attention and affection in ways I never could. But watching her being led away in handcuffs, ranting about betrayal and destruction, I realized that her power had always been illusory. She'd built her identity on manipulation and criminality, and when those foundations crumbled, there was nothing substantial left. "I think," I replied with genuine serenity, "that I'll be just fine." As David and Vanessa were escorted from the ballroom, our remaining dinner guests sat in stunned silence, processing the extraordinary events they'd just witnessed. The anniversary celebration that had begun as an elegant social gathering had transformed into the climactic scene of a federal investigation, leaving everyone struggling to understand their roles in a drama they hadn't realized they were participating in. Harold was the first to break the silence, his voice heavy with decades of accumulated wisdom and recent disillusionment. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I've been concerned about David's behavior for months, but I chose to trust his explanations rather than investigating my suspicions. If I'd been more vigilant, perhaps we could have prevented some of the damage he's caused." The self-recrimination in Harold's voice was painful to hear. As David's mentor and father figure, he felt responsible for the criminal activities that had developed under his indirect supervision. But his guilt was misplaced. David's transformation from ambitious young professional to sophisticated criminal had been gradual and carefully concealed, designed specifically to avoid detection by people who cared about him. "Harold, you're not responsible for David's choices," I assured him. "He specifically exploited your trust and affection to avoid scrutiny. The deception was intentional and sophisticated. Even someone with your experience couldn't have detected it without access to information that David deliberately kept hidden." Marcus was struggling with more practical concerns about the immediate future of Crawford development and the investments he'd made based on David's fraudulent representations. "Sarah, do you have any idea what this means for the company's ongoing projects? I've got clients with signed contracts and investors who've committed millions based on David's projections." The question was critically important for everyone connected to Crawford Development's legitimate operations. While David's criminal activities would be prosecuted separately, the collapse of his business empire would have real-world consequences for employees, clients, and investors who'd trusted him with their financial futures. Agent Gonzalez mentioned that federal prosecutors will work to minimize collateral damage to legitimate business interests, I explained. There will likely be opportunities to restructure projects and contracts to protect innocent parties, but it will require careful legal review to separate criminal activities from legitimate business operations. Jennifer, who'd been unusually quiet during the arrest proceedings, finally spoke up with the analytical perspective that had made her such a valuable ally during my investigation. The forensic accounting review will be crucial for determining which assets and contracts can be preserved versus which ones are tainted by criminal activity. Based on what I observed in Sarah's documentation, there are probably significant legitimate business components that can be salvaged. Her assessment provided some hope for the employees and partners whose livelihoods depended on Crawford Development's continued operation. While David's criminal enterprise would be dismantled, the underlying real estate business had genuine value that could potentially be preserved under new management. My father, drawing on his extensive experience with white-collar criminal cases, offered additional perspective on the legal processes that would unfold over the coming months. The federal government's priority will be recovering assets that represent proceeds of criminal activity, but they also have strong incentives to minimize economic disruption for innocent parties. There will likely be opportunities to negotiate arrangements that protect legitimate business interests while ensuring appropriate punishment for criminal behavior. The conversation continued for another hour as our group processed the evening's revelations and began planning responses to the crisis that David's arrest had created. Phone calls were made to attorneys, accountants, and business advisors. Emergency meetings were scheduled to address immediate concerns about ongoing projects and financial obligations. Crisis management strategies were developed to protect reputations and minimize legal exposure. Throughout these discussions, I felt a strange sense of detachment from the chaos surrounding David's collapse. For 18 months, I'd been living in a state of constant vigilance, carefully documenting evidence while maintaining the facade of an unsuspecting wife. The successful conclusion of the federal investigation represented not just justice for David's victims, but personal liberation from the exhausting double life I'd been forced to live. Agent Gonzalez returned to our table as the evening was winding down, carrying a briefcase that presumably contained additional documentation related to the investigation. Mrs. Crawford, there are a few administrative matters we need to address regarding your continued cooperation with our investigation. The phrase "continued cooperation" suggested that my involvement with federal authorities wasn't ending with David and Vanessa's arrests. The RICO case would likely require extensive testimony about the evidence I'd gathered and the methods I'd used to document their criminal activities. Of course, I replied, genuinely willing to provide whatever assistance might be needed to ensure successful prosecution. What do you need from me? We'll need formal statements documenting your observations of Mr. Crawford's activities, your methods for gathering evidence, and your knowledge of his associates and business relationships, Agent Gonzalez explained. Additionally, there may be opportunities for you to assist with recovering assets that represent proceeds of criminal activity. The mention of asset recovery was particularly interesting. David's criminal enterprise had generated enormous profits that were hidden in complex networks of shell companies and offshore accounts. Recovering those assets would require someone with intimate knowledge of his business operations and financial arrangements. I'm prepared to provide whatever assistance you need, I assured her. David's activities affected too many innocent people for me to be concerned about protecting his interests. Agent Gonzalez smiled with what appeared to be genuine respect. Mrs. Crawford, I've been investigating white-collar crime for 15 years, and I've rarely encountered civilian cooperation as thorough and professional as what you've provided. Your documentation was instrumental in building this case, and your courage in continuing the investigation despite personal risk was remarkable. The praise felt surreal after months of questioning whether I was making the right choices. Living with someone you're actively investigating requires a level of psychological compartmentalization that's difficult to maintain indefinitely. There had been moments when I'd wondered whether I was betraying David unfairly, whether his explanations for suspicious activities might actually be legitimate. But watching him being led away in handcuffs, still trying to blame me for the consequences of his criminal choices, confirmed that my instincts had been accurate. David hadn't been a misguided businessman who'd made poor decisions. He'd been a calculating criminal who'd systematically defrauded clients, partners, and government agencies while building a facade of legitimate success. As our guests began departing Rosewood Manor, each offering support and expressing amazement at the evening's revelations, I found myself alone with my immediate family for the first time since David's arrest. The silence was profound after hours of intense conversation and dramatic confrontation. "So," my mother said finally, "what happens now? Personally, I mean, not legally." Her question addressed the fundamental issue that all the legal proceedings and business restructuring couldn't resolve. After 3 years of marriage and 18 months of investigation, I needed to rebuild my life from foundations that had been completely compromised. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "For so long, my focus has been on gathering evidence and building the case against David. I haven't thought much about what comes after that process is complete." The confession revealed how completely the investigation had consumed my life, leaving little energy for planning beyond its successful conclusion. Jennifer, ever practical, offered the perspective that would guide my thinking over the coming weeks. "Sarah, you've demonstrated investigative skills and analytical capabilities that would be valuable in consulting or law enforcement. This experience has given you expertise that could help other people in similar situations." The suggestion was intriguing. My accidental transformation into an effective intelligence gatherer had revealed abilities I'd never recognized in myself. The possibility of using those skills to help other victims of white-collar crime was appealing, both personally and professionally. My father's assessment was more focused on immediate legal concerns. "Regardless of what you decide to do professionally, you'll need excellent legal representation for the divorce proceedings and any civil litigation that emerges from David's criminal activities. The asset recovery process could be particularly complex if prosecutors determine that marital property includes proceeds of criminal activity. The practical implications of divorcing someone under federal indictment were daunting. Traditional divorce proceedings assumed that both parties were operating in good faith and had legitimate claims to marital assets. When one spouse was facing potential decades in federal prison for activities that had generated much of the couple's wealth, the legal landscape became far more complicated. Agent Gonzalez had warned me that federal prosecutors would likely seek forfeiture of assets that represented proceeds of criminal activity, potentially including our home, vehicles, and investment accounts. While I hadn't participated in David's crimes, proving my innocence might require extensive legal proceedings that could take years to resolve. But those challenges seemed manageable compared to the psychological relief of no longer living with someone whose activities put me at constant risk of legal jeopardy. For 18 months, I'd been documenting evidence of crimes that could have implicated me simply through association. The successful conclusion of the investigation meant that I could finally begin rebuilding my life without the constant fear of criminal exposure. As we prepared to leave Rosewood Manor, I took a final look around the ballroom where David and I had celebrated our anniversary just hours earlier. The elegant space that had witnessed our confrontation with Vanessa and the subsequent arrests would forever be associated with the end of my marriage and the beginning of whatever came next. The irony wasn't lost on me that our anniversary celebration had become the perfect metaphor for our relationship. What appeared to be a joyous occasion commemorating shared success had actually been a carefully orchestrated revelation of hidden deceptions and criminal activities. The marriage that had seemed solid on the surface had been built on foundations that were fundamentally corrupt. But unlike our marriage, the investigation had been built on solid foundations of evidence and legal procedure. The justice that David and Vanessa would face wasn't based on emotional betrayal or personal vengeance. It was the inevitable consequence of criminal choices that had been carefully documented and professionally analyzed. As Agent Gonzalez had predicted, the arrest of David and Vanessa was just the beginning of a legal process that would unfold over months or years. But for me, it represented something more immediate and personal. It was the moment when I stopped being the unknowing, wife of a criminal, and became the informed architect of my own future. The surprise I'd prepared for Vanessa hadn't just been about exposing her crimes or ending her manipulation of David. It had been about reclaiming my own agency and power in a situation where I'd been systematically diminished and deceived. The woman who'd crashed our anniversary celebration expecting to humiliate me had instead walked into a trap that revealed her own vulnerability and ultimate powerlessness. Justice, it turned out, was far more satisfying than revenge could ever have been. 2 years after that fateful anniversary dinner, I stood in the marble lobby of the newly renamed Turner Investigative Services, watching my team of forensic accountants and fraud investigators prepare for another complex case involving corporate corruption. The irony of the situation never failed to amaze me. The woman who'd once been dismissed as David Crawford's naive wife had built one of Chicago's most respected white-collar crime consulting firms. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. David's trial had consumed 8 months of my life, requiring testimony that laid bare every detail of his criminal enterprise while forcing me to relive the deception and betrayal that had defined our marriage. Vanessa had attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would have reduced her sentence in exchange for testimony against David, but her credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed by contradictory statements that prosecutors rejected her overtures. Both received sentences that reflected the magnitude of their crimes. David was given 22 years in federal prison, while Vanessa received 18 years for her role in the money laundering conspiracy. The judge had been particularly harsh in his assessment of their criminal partnership, noting that their willingness to exploit personal relationships for criminal gain demonstrated a level of moral corruption that warranted maximum deterrence. The asset forfeiture process had been equally devastating to their remaining supporters. Nearly everything David had accumulated during our marriage was determined to be proceeds of criminal activity, subject to government seizure. The mansion we'd shared, the luxury vehicles, the investment accounts, even personal jewelry and artwork had been liquidated to compensate victims of their fraud. But the most satisfying aspect of their downfall hadn't been the prison sentences or financial ruin. It had been watching their carefully constructed personas crumble under the weight of revealed truth. David's reputation as a visionary entrepreneur became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Vanessa's image as a successful independent businesswoman transformed into a warning about the consequences of criminal partnerships. The federal investigation had ultimately expanded far beyond David and Vanessa's operations, leading to indictments of 17 additional individuals connected to the money laundering network they'd been serving. The criminal organization that had used their real estate businesses to clean illegal profits turned out to be one of the largest such operations in the Midwest, with tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses across multiple states. My role in exposing this network had attracted attention from other law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. The FBI had offered me a position as a civilian consultant, working with victims of white-collar crime to gather evidence and build cases against sophisticated criminal operations. The work was challenging and often dangerous, but it provided a sense of purpose that I'd never experienced during my marriage to David. Harold Westbrook had played a crucial role in my transition from victim to professional investigator. His guilt over David's deception had motivated him to become one of my first clients, hiring me to conduct a complete audit of Crawford Development's operations and help him rebuild the company under ethical leadership. The process had been therapeutic for both of us, allowing him to confront his failure to detect David's crimes while giving me the opportunity to apply my investigative skills in a constructive manner. The success of that initial project had led to referrals from other business leaders who needed expert assistance with fraud detection and corporate compliance. Within 6 months, I had more work than I could handle alone, necessitating the hiring of additional investigators and support staff. The business had grown organically, driven by word-of-mouth recommendations from satisfied clients who appreciated my unique combination of investigative expertise and personal understanding of betrayal. Marcus Reed had been another early supporter, both personally and professionally. His investment losses from David's fraud had been substantial, but his family's financial stability had been preserved through insurance claims and successful civil litigation against David's criminal assets. More importantly, his emotional recovery had been aided by his involvement in rebuilding Crawford Development as a legitimately ethical operation. The civil litigation process had been almost as satisfying as the criminal proceedings. David's victims had recovered millions of dollars through lawsuits that pierced the corporate veils he'd used to hide criminal profits. Vanessa's Miami assets had been particularly valuable for compensation purposes, since her entire business operation had been built on proceeds from their Chicago fraud. But the most meaningful vindication had come through the personal relationships that had been strengthened rather than damaged by my decision to expose David's crimes. My marriage to David had isolated me from many friendships, as his controlling behavior had gradually reduced my social circle to people he approved of. The investigation process had reconnected me with old friends while introducing me to new colleagues who valued my intelligence and integrity. Jennifer had become my business partner as well as my sister, bringing her forensic accounting expertise to Turner Investigative Services. Our professional collaboration had deepened our personal relationship, creating the kind of sisterly bond that our childhood had never quite achieved. Working together to help other victims of financial fraud had given us shared purpose that transcended family obligation. My parents had been instrumental in establishing the legal framework for my consulting business, ensuring that my work with law enforcement agencies was properly structured to protect both my interests and those of my clients. Their pride in my transformation from victim to advocate had been evident in countless small gestures and public statements about my professional accomplishments. The divorce proceedings with David had been surprisingly straightforward, given the criminal circumstances. His incarceration and financial ruin had eliminated most potential disputes about asset division or ongoing obligations. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed before our marriage had included forfeiture clauses for criminal activity, effectively negating any claims he might have had to my inherited assets or professional income. More importantly, the divorce had legally severed my connection to David's criminal legacy, allowing me to rebuild my identity without the burden of his continued presence in my life. The woman who'd been defined as David Crawford's wife for 3 years had become Sarah Turner, successful entrepreneur and respected fraud investigator. The emotional healing had taken longer than the legal resolution, requiring professional counseling to address the trauma of living with someone whose entire personality had been a carefully constructed lie. The betrayal hadn't just been about criminal activity or infidelity. It had been about the systematic erosion of my ability to trust my own perceptions and judgments. But that healing process had ultimately strengthened my ability to help other victims of similar crimes. The clients who sought my assistance weren't just dealing with financial losses. They were struggling with the psychological damage that comes from discovering that someone they trusted had systematically deceived and exploited them. My personal experience with betrayal and recovery had given me credibility with these clients that no amount of professional training could provide. When I explained how David's manipulation had affected my ability to recognize obvious warning signs, they understood that their own blindness to criminal activity wasn't a personal failing, but a natural consequence of trust being systematically exploited. The consulting work had also revealed patterns in white-collar crime that weren't apparent from individual cases. David and Vanessa's operation had been sophisticated, but it followed predictable patterns that were repeated in criminal enterprises across the country. The ability to recognize these patterns had made me increasingly valuable to law enforcement agencies investigating complex financial crimes. Agent Gonzalez had become both a professional colleague and personal friend, collaborating with me on cases that required the unique combination of federal resources and civilian insight that our partnership provided. Her recommendation had been crucial in establishing my credibility with other law enforcement agencies, leading to consulting, contracts with state and local prosecutors across the Midwest. The work wasn't without risks. Investigating sophisticated criminal operations meant exposing myself to potential retaliation from people with significant resources and few moral constraints. The security measures I'd implemented for my business and personal life were extensive, including professional protection services and advanced surveillance detection capabilities. But the risks were manageable compared to the satisfaction of helping other victims achieve justice and recovery. Each successful investigation represented not just individual vindication, but contribution to a broader effort to hold white-collar criminals accountable for their crimes. The financial success of Turner Investigative Services had exceeded my wildest expectations during those dark months when I'd been gathering evidence against David while maintaining the facade of marital happiness. The business generated more revenue than David's legitimate operations had ever produced, proving that ethical professional practices were not only morally superior, but also more profitable in the long term. That financial independence had allowed me to be selective about the cases I accepted, focusing on situations where my assistance could make the greatest difference for victims, while contributing to broader law enforcement efforts against organized white-collar crime. The work was challenging and often emotionally demanding, but it provided the kind of professional fulfillment that I'd never experienced during my marriage. As I reviewed the case files for our latest investigation, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by that anniversary dinner when Vanessa had crashed our celebration expecting to humiliate me. Her dramatic entrance had indeed been the catalyst for surprise, but not the kind she'd anticipated. The surprise hadn't been her ability to disrupt my marriage or reclaim David's attention. It had been my revelation that I possessed the intelligence, courage, and determination to build something far more valuable than anything David and Vanessa had created through their criminal partnership. Their enterprise had been built on deception, exploitation, and the systematic betrayal of trust. My business was founded on truth, justice, and the restoration of dignity to people who'd been victimized by criminals who thought they were too sophisticated to face consequences. The contrast couldn't have been more complete. David and Vanessa had used their intelligence and resources to harm innocent people for personal gain. I had channeled my abilities toward protecting the innocent and ensuring that criminals faced appropriate accountability. 3 years after that fateful evening, I received an unexpected letter from David, written from federal prison where he was serving his sentence. The communication was brief and carefully worded, presumably reviewed by prison officials before being sent. He claimed to have found religion and expressed regret for the pain his actions had caused, though he stopped short of taking full responsibility for his criminal choices. The letter requested forgiveness and suggested that he hoped we might correspond during his incarceration, maintaining some connection despite the circumstances that had destroyed our marriage. His tone was manipulative in subtle ways, attempting to recast his criminality as misguided business decisions while portraying his imprisonment as excessive punishment for relatively minor mistakes. I never responded to David's letter or the several others that followed over subsequent months. The man who'd systematically deceived me for years had forfeited any claim to my time, attention, or emotional energy. My focus was entirely on the future I was building rather than the past he'd tried to destroy. Vanessa never attempted to contact me, which wasn't surprising given her continued insistence that she'd been victimized by David rather than being an equal partner in their criminal enterprise. Media reports from her trial suggested that she maintained her innocence even after conviction, blaming David for manipulating her into activities she claimed not to understand. The final vindication came through professional recognition that exceeded anything I could have imagined during those 18 months when I'd been secretly gathering evidence. The American Bar Association honored me with their Outstanding Civilian Contribution to Law Enforcement Award, recognizing my role in exposing one of the largest money laundering operations in recent history. Standing at the podium to accept that award, I thought about the journey that had brought me from naive wife to respected professional. The transformation hadn't been easy or pleasant, but it had revealed capabilities and strength that I'd never known I possessed. The woman who'd dropped a champagne glass in shock at Vanessa's dramatic entrance had become someone who could face down sophisticated criminals without flinching. The wife who'd been dismissed as uninformed about business matters had built a successful enterprise that generated more legitimate revenue than her husband's criminal operation ever had. Most importantly, the victim who'd been systematically deceived and manipulated had become an advocate who helped other victims achieve justice and recovery. The surprise that Vanessa had been waiting for hadn't been her triumph over me. It had been my transformation into someone she could never have imagined or anticipated. As I concluded my acceptance speech and looked out at an audience filled with law enforcement professionals and victim advocates, I realized that the greatest surprise of all had been discovering who I really was beneath the facade David had tried to impose on me. The anniversary that had begun as a celebration of my marriage had become the foundation for celebrating my independence, my professional success, and my contribution to justice for countless victims of white-collar crime. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.